At its peak, Singer ran 600 sewing centers across America and trained 400,000 homemakers to sew. Inside one New Jersey plant, they built an 11-pound machine quilters still call the greatest ever made. Then the company decided simplicity wasn't the future. A zigzag line that redefined what Singer sold. A touch and sew model, plastic gears, nylon parts that captured half the company's revenue in a single year. A diversification push into calculators and defense contracts until sewing became an afterthought. An Elizabeth plant that dimmed shift by shift until it closed in 1982. 109 years of production ended. The site is an industrial park now. Part of it burned in 2024. This is the story of how an actor and a lawyer built a sewing empire that changed American households, and how the company they created walked away from its own masterpiece. Not in a single betrayal, but through a long series of choices, each one reasonable, each one moving further from the machine that never needed replacing. The story starts in Chicago, in the summer of 1933, inside a hall of machines at the Century of Progress International Exposition. The country was broke. A quarter of the American workforce had no job. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Banks had failed by the thousands. And the Singer Manufacturing Company, already the most recognized sewing machine brand on the planet, already 82 years into a run that had made it a household name on 5 continents, wheeled out something nobody had asked for. A portable sewing machine that weighed 11 pounds. 11 pounds. You could carry it with one hand. You could set it on a kitchen table and sew a dress, fold it back into its black carrying case, and slide it under a bed. In a decade defined by scarcity, Singer had built a machine defined by compression. Every ounce of industrial knowledge the company possessed squeezed into a cast aluminum body small enough to take on a train. The case had a handle. The machine had a light. The whole package was no bigger than a bread box, and it sewed a straighter line than machines 3 times its weight. They called it the Featherweight Model 221, and it would become, in the estimation of generations of American quilters, the finest straight-stitch sewing machine ever manufactured. A machine so precisely engineered that units built in the 1930s still produce flawless seams today, not as museum curiosities, but as working tools, carried to quilting circles in padded bags, threaded and oiled and run hard by women who've tried every modern machine on the market and come back to this one. But in 1933, nobody knew any of that yet. What they knew was that Singer had been making sewing machines for 82 years, that the company's name was stamped on more household machines than any brand in human history, and that the man who'd started it all had been dead for nearly 60 years. A man who didn't invent the sewing machine, didn't patent the most important part of it, and spent most of his early career trying to make it as an actor. His name was Isaac Merritt Singer. And like a lot of American origin stories, his began with someone else's idea, a rented workshop, and an ego large enough to fill both. Isaac Singer was born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, the son of German immigrants who couldn't hold their household together. He left home at 12. By his 20s, he'd worked as an apprentice machinist, a canal digger, a laborer, and, when opportunity allowed, and sometimes when it didn't, a touring actor with a traveling troupe, performing Shakespeare to small-town audiences across upstate New York and Ohio. He loved the stage. He loved audiences. He loved, by most accounts, the sound of his own voice. The machinery work was what paid. The acting was what Singer believed he was meant for. What he didn't love was other people's machines. In 1851, in a rented shop in Boston belonging to a machinist named Orson Phelps, Singer examined a sewing machine based on a design by Lero and Blodgett. It didn't work well. The thread jammed. The mechanism stuttered. The needle arrangement was clumsy, the fabric feeding unreliable, the whole thing more promising as a concept than it was functional as a tool. Singer looked at the machine and told Phelps he could fix it. He rebuilt it in 11 days. 11 days from broken concept to working prototype. What Singer redesigned wasn't the fundamental principle. Elias Howe had already patented the lock-stitch mechanism that made mechanical sewing possible, and that patent would haunt Singer for years. But the practical execution. Singer mounted the needle vertically instead of horizontally. He added a presser foot to hold the fabric flat. He designed a foot treadle for power, freeing the operator's hands. He made the machine actually usable by a person sitting at a table, running cloth through at a steady pace, producing seams that held. The idea wasn't new. What was new was a machine that a woman in a parlor could sit down to, and within an afternoon learn to operate. And that machine would have died in Phelps's rented shop if Isaac Singer hadn't met the man who understood what a working sewing machine was actually worth. Edward Clark was a New York lawyer, methodical, patient, shrewd, and constitutionally allergic to the kind of bombast that came naturally to Singer. Clark didn't care about the theater. He didn't care about the showmanship. He looked at Singer's redesigned machine and saw something the inventor himself may not have fully grasped. Not a patent to be fought over, not a curiosity for exhibitions, but a household product that could be manufactured at scale and sold to the American public in numbers that would make them both very rich. Clark became Singer's partner in 1851. The arrangement gave Clark half the business in exchange for legal representation and business management. It was, by any measure, the best deal Clark ever made, and the partnership that turned a tinkerer's redesign into one of the first modern consumer brands in the United States. It worked because the two men wanted entirely different things. Singer wanted fame, admiration, and applause. Clark wanted systems. Singer would literally sing the song of the shirt at county fairs while a woman demonstrated the machine beside him. Part salesman, part carnival barker, all showman, his voice booming over the crowd while the needle punched through cotton. Clark, meanwhile, was building the infrastructure that would make the showmanship pay. He opened showrooms in major cities where women could see the machines in elegant settings. He hired trained demonstrators, women, not men, because he understood that a female customer was more likely to trust a female instructor. He established a repair and service network so that a machine sold in Ohio could be maintained in Ohio. And most critically, he introduced a financing innovation that changed American retail forever: installment buying. In the 1850s, a Singer sewing machine cost roughly $125, a sum that might represent a quarter of a working family's annual income. Clark's answer was to let customers pay over time. A few dollars down, a dollar or two a week. It was risky. It was unheard of for a manufactured product of that price. Skeptics said customers would default, that the machines would be repossessed at a loss, that no serious business could survive on promises. Clark did it anyway, and it worked. Suddenly, a machine that no working household could afford in a single purchase became a machine that almost any household could manage. And once the machine was in the home, the seams it produced sold the next machine to the neighbor. By 1860, Singer and Clark had built the world's largest sewing machine manufacturer. Not just in America. In the world, there was a price for getting there. Elias Howe, who held the original lock-stitch patent, sued Singer for infringement and won. The resulting legal warfare nearly strangled the young industry, with multiple manufacturers locked in overlapping claims and countersuits that paralyzed production and drained capital. The breakthrough came from a patent attorney named Orlando Potter, who proposed something no one had tried before in American manufacturing: a patent pool. The sewing machine combination, formed in 1856, gathered the major patent holders under one licensing agreement. Every manufacturer paid into the pool. Every manufacturer could build freely. The lawsuits stopped, the courtrooms emptied, and the industry accelerated. Singer had survived its first real crisis, not through brilliance on the stage and not through dominance in the courtroom, but through the pragmatism of men who understood that cooperation could be more profitable than warfare. It was a lesson the company would eventually forget. Isaac Singer himself spent his later years in Europe, wealthy, flamboyant, maintaining multiple households, and fathering at least 24 children by various women across 2 continents. He died in 1875 in Torquay, England, a rich man who'd outrun his origins but never quite outgrown them. That same year, the company bearing his name sold roughly 250,000 machines, far outpacing any rival on Earth. The actor was gone. The empire he'd accidentally helped build was just getting started. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. What Singer built after its founder died wasn't just a manufacturing company, it was a distribution system, an educational network, and a cultural engine that taught American women, by the hundreds of thousands, that they could make their own clothes, furnish their own homes, and master a machine that had once been reserved for commercial tailors and professional dressmakers. The Singer Sewing Center became the instrument. By 1951, the company operated 600 of them across the United States, in downtowns and suburbs, on main streets in towns that might not have had much else in the way of specialty retail. They weren't just shops where you bought a machine and left. Walk into a Singer Sewing Center in the 1940s, and you'd find bolts of fabric stacked on wooden shelves, pattern books from McCall's, and Butterick fanned out on a counter, replacement bobbins and needles in glass display cases, spools of thread sorted by color, and behind all of it, a classroom. Tables, machines, and an instructor. Singer employed women to teach women how to thread a bobbin, how to oil a machine, how to set a stitch length and adjust the tension so the thread didn't pucker, how to read a pattern, those tissue paper blueprints with their cryptic markings and dotted fold lines and mysterious symbols that meant cut here or place on fold, and turn a flat piece of cloth into a child's school dress, a set of kitchen curtains, a Sunday blouse with darts and pleats that actually fit. The company's own records claim that by 1951, those sewing centers had trained an estimated 400,000 homemakers. That number is almost certainly conservative, and it only counts the formal classes, not the millions of women who learned from a neighbor who'd learned from a Singer instructor. The knowledge rippling outward through church sewing circles, 4-H clubs, home economics classrooms, and mother-daughter afternoons at the dining room table. This was selling at a level that went far beyond advertising. Singer wasn't offering a machine. It was offering competence, the quiet confidence of knowing you could measure, cut, pin, and sew, that the garment you were making would fit because you'd made it to fit, because you'd learned how from someone who knew. Domestic efficiency and personal pride, bundled together with every purchased machine. In a country where home sewing was still a practical necessity for millions of families who couldn't afford ready-made clothing for every child in every season, Singer had positioned itself as the enabler, the company that didn't just sell you the tool but taught you how to use it, and then kept coming back to make sure you could. Door-to-door salesmen carried portable demonstration models through neighborhoods, knocking on screen doors and setting up on kitchen tables. Showroom windows displayed the latest machines on polished wood cabinets, objects handsome enough to sit in a parlor, because they would sit in the parlor, visible to guests, a piece of furniture as much as a piece of equipment. Trade-in programs let customers swap last decade's model for this decade's improvement. Service contracts kept machines running for years, sometimes decades, a Singer serviceman arriving with his toolkit to adjust the tension, replace a belt, oil the mechanism, and leave the machine running smoother than it had in months. Singer had invented the modern appliance business model: sell, service, teach, upgrade, repeat, before most American households owned a television. And the machines themselves kept improving, each generation slightly more refined, slightly more capable, slightly more suited to the needs of a country where ready-to-wear clothing was slowly expanding, but hadn't yet replaced the home seamstress. Singer navigated the Depression without breaking. Other sewing machine makers folded or shrank. Companies that had competed with Singer since the patent pool days dropped away. Their names forgotten while Singer's name stayed on the storefronts and in the advertisements. The company converted to wartime production when the government called, building precision military components alongside its peacetime lines, then converted back when the fighting stopped, resuming civilian manufacture with the efficiency of a company that had already been mass-producing to tight tolerances for the better part of a century. Through 2 world wars, through economic collapse and economic boom, through the Great Migration that brought millions of Black Americans north to factory cities where Singer plants operated, through the post-war suburban expansion that scattered American households across landscapes that hadn't existed a decade earlier, Singer held its position. The machine American women reached for when they sat down to sew, the name they trusted, the brand that meant sewing the way Ford meant automobiles. But something was shifting underneath the success, slowly enough that you'd miss it if you weren't watching the right numbers. Home sewing was changing, not vanishing. Not yet, not for decades, but migrating from one category to another. What had once been necessity was becoming choice. A woman in 1920 sewed because she had to, because buying every garment for a family of 5 or 6 was beyond what the household budget could bear. A woman in 1955 often sewed because she wanted to, because the fabric was nicer than what Sears offered off the rack, because the fit was personal, because the craft itself was satisfying in a way that writing a check at a department store counter was not. Ready to wear kept getting cheaper and more widely available, and the cold economic argument for sewing your own clothes kept getting thinner, year by year, as the racks at the department stores got fuller. That shift mattered enormously, though its full consequences wouldn't arrive for years. When sewing was necessity, every household needed a machine. When sewing was a pastime, only some households did. And the machines those hobbyist sewers wanted, the women choosing to sew rather than forced to, were different machines. They wanted more features, more stitches, more versatility. The simple, unadorned straight stitch machine that had built Singer's empire was, year by year, becoming less obviously sufficient for a market that was learning to want more than a perfect seam. Nobody inside Singer saw that as a crisis in the early 1950s. The company was selling machines faster than ever. The sewing centers were packed. The brand name carried a weight that most consumer companies would have paid any fortune to achieve. But the ground was shifting, the way it always does before the surface cracks, and the machine that would come to represent everything Singer had gotten right was already on a collision course with a future that no longer valued what it did best. The Singer 221 Featherweight arrived at the 1933 World's Fair as a feat of compression. Every decision in its design pointed the same direction. Less weight, less bulk, less complication. A cast aluminum body instead of the cast iron that made most sewing machines double as anchors. A single straight stitch, no zigzag, no decorative patterns, no automatic buttonhole, executed with a precision that the machine's diminutive size seemed to forbid. 11 pounds and 1 ounce, according to the collectors who've weighed hundreds of them on postal scales. A machine you could carry to a quilting circle the way you'd carry a lunchbox to work. The engineers behind it left their names on a patent filed for the 221 class drive mechanism, Leonard C. Marsack and David A. Gracer. Their patent describes a lightweight portable sewing machine and the mechanical solution to a specific problem: how to deliver consistent stitch tension and reliable feed dog movement inside a housing that weighed less than a large house cat. The answer was elegant in the way that good mechanical engineering is always elegant when it works. Nothing wasted, nothing redundant, every component sized and placed and fitted to do exactly one job without play, without slop, without the accumulated looseness that turns a precise machine into an imprecise one after a few thousand hours of use. The body was aluminum, but the working parts were steel. The gears were metal. The bobbin case was metal. The tension assembly was metal. The needle bar, the presser foot mechanism, the hand wheel. Metal, all of it. Machined to tolerances that would hold across decades of continuous use. When a quilter today picks up a featherweight built in the 1940s, threads it with cotton, and runs a seam across 2 layers of fabric, what she feels through her hands and hears through the quiet room is a machine that doesn't vibrate where it shouldn't, doesn't drift where it shouldn't, doesn't chatter or skip or pull. The stitch comes out so consistent, top and bottom, first inch to last, that the back of the fabric looks as clean as the front. That isn't nostalgia talking. That's engineering talking. The design didn't allow for meaningful deterioration because there was nothing in the machine built to degrade on a human timescale. A featherweight, maintained with a few drops of oil and basic care, would outlast the woman who bought it and the daughter who inherited it. That durability wasn't quite a selling point in 1933. Not in those terms. Singer priced the featherweight above its larger, heavier machines, which struck some Depression-era buyers as backwards. Why pay more for less machine? Some shoppers thought the 221 looked like a toy. The carrying case, black, compact, chrome-latched, was handsome, but it also made the machine look like something you'd bring on a vacation rather than something you'd trust with a winter coat. Those doubts were reasonable at the time. What those doubters couldn't know was that the thing that made the featherweight look small was exactly the thing that would make it irreplaceable. It did less, and what it did better than anything on the market, for longer than anyone imagined a machine could last. The cult arrived slowly, estate sales and quilting guilds rather than advertising campaigns. Machines passed down through families like jewelry boxes, collectors bidding prices that would have baffled the original buyers, women carrying featherweights to guild meetings in custom sewn bags with pockets for bobbins and presser feet and the little screwdriver you use to adjust the needle plate. None of that was inevitable in the Depression. It was earned, stitch by stitch, decade by decade, by a machine that simply refused to stop being good at the one thing it was built to do. Production ran at Singer's U.S. facilities from 1933 onward, interrupted only by the war. Singer's own corporate history records that sewing machine development ceased from 1939 to 1945 as the company converted to wartime production. Precision components, military hardware, the industrial pivot that nearly every major American manufacturer made when the government came calling and the contracts arrived. The featherweight waited. When production resumed after the war, the machine came back essentially unchanged because there was nothing that needed changing. The engineers had gotten it right the first time, and the post-war market confirmed it. The quilters founded in the late 1940s and 1950s. Not through advertising, Singer never marketed the 2-1 specifically to the quilting community, but through use. Word passed at quilting bees and guild meetings, one woman bringing her featherweight and another watching the seams come out and asking where she'd found it. The featherweight did one thing so well that the women who cared most about that one thing recognized what they had. Straight stitch quilting demands consistency above all else. Hundreds of seams across a quilt top, thousands of stitches, each one holding the same tension, the same length, the same clean bite through layered cotton. A stitch that wanders even slightly multiplies across a queen-size quilt into visible misalignment. The featherweight didn't wander. It couldn't. The engineering wouldn't let it. And it delivered that consistency in a package light enough to carry to the church basement on quilting night and quiet enough to run in a living room while the children slept down the hall. That low mechanical purr, not the industrial clatter of a full-size Singer, bolted into a wooden cabinet, but a sound more like a contented hum, a sound that said the gears were meshing and the motor was working and everything was precisely as it should be, became the backdrop to concentrated private work. A woman bent over fabric with pins between her lips, a pattern spread across the table, the machine humming under her hands. And the smell of it, the machine's oil, that particular mineral sweetness that anyone who's ever unlatched a featherweight case and lifted the lid knows on contact, mixed with the faint, clean scent of sewing machine lubricant and the warmth of the motor, became as bound to the quilting experience as the cotton and the thread themselves. For a generation of American quilters, the 221 wasn't just a good machine. It was the machine. And the company that built it was about to decide the machine wasn't enough. In 1873, the Singer Manufacturing Company purchased 32 acres on the Elizabeth, New Jersey waterfront and started building. What rose on that land over the following decades was more than a factory. It was a production campus, foundries, machine shops, assembly halls, finishing rooms, testing stations, and shipping docks, all connected by internal rail lines, all organized around the steady manufacture of sewing machines, bound for every corner of the American market and dozens of countries beyond. At its peak, the Elizabeth complex employed thousands. The exact figure depends on the period and the definition. A 1982 federal court record, filed during the bitter legal fight over the plant's closure, references approximately 10,000 employees during the facility's strongest production years and notes that 3,500 workers were still employed there as late as 1973. Singer's own publicity at various points cited figures as high as 40,000 across its full Elizabeth operations, though that number appears to encompass a broader workforce definition and a wider time span. The numbers shift. What doesn't shift is the scale. Elizabeth was one of Singer's defining production complexes, a facility so large and so rooted in its place that it operated on the same waterfront site for more than a century, outlasting the founder by generations, outlasting the market conditions that had justified its construction, outlasting almost everything except the buildings themselves. For the men and women who worked those lines, the Elizabeth plant wasn't an entry in an annual report. It was a daily fact, a career rhythm, a family pattern so deeply grooved that it shaped how whole households understood the future. Your father worked the floor at Singer. His father had worked the floor. The paycheck that came home on Friday bought the house you grew up in, covered the mortgage, filled the refrigerator, put shoes on the kids, and funded the quiet expectation that you'd walk through those same gates when your turn came. That was the compact. Not written down, not guaranteed. Understood the way people who live near a river understand the current. It's there, it's been there, it'll be there. The plant made sewing machines in peacetime and made what the country required in wartime. Singer converted to military production with the discipline of a company that already understood precision manufacturing at an industrial scale. The same tolerances that kept a featherweight's stitch consistent could produce munitions components and military hardware to government specifications. When the wars ended, the lines converted back, the workforce settled into the familiar cadence, and the parking lots filled again before dawn. The shift whistle blew. The cafeteria served coffee and eggs to the morning crew. The loading docks sent crated machines to rail cars and freight trucks headed for Singer warehouses across the country. A rhythm, a pulse, a life organized around the simple fact that the plant was running. Elizabeth itself orbited the complex the way dozens of American cities orbited their anchor factories. Not a company town in the formal sense, Singer didn't own the houses or the grocery stores, but a place where one employer's health and the community's health were so tightly braided that separating them would have been like pulling the spine from a body. The diners near the gates ran on shift schedules, eggs and toast at 5 in the morning, meatloaf specials at the shift change. The bars on the surrounding streets filled Friday evenings with men whose hands smelled of machine oil and cutting fluid, men who'd been on their feet since before dawn, and who ordered their beers with the particular satisfaction of a paycheck earned. The barber who cut their hair knew which department they worked in. The grocer who sold them bread knew their wives by name. The churches where those families sat on Sundays, the schools where their children learned, the Little League diamonds where their kids played under lights on summer evenings, all of it rested on the steady assumption that the plant would keep running, that Singer would keep building, that the name on the water tower would keep meaning what it had always meant. By the early 1950s, that assumption had never looked safer. 600 sewing centers across America, training homemakers by the tens of thousands each year. The Featherweight in production alongside the company's full-size cabinet models. A brand recognition so thorough that the word Singer and the word sewing machine had become nearly interchangeable in the American vocabulary. The women at the centers, the workers on the Elizabeth lines, the fabric stores, the pattern books, the quilts, all one organism, all breathing. And then the company that had built one of the most beloved straight stitch machines in American history decided that the future didn't lie in straight stitches at all. In 1952, Singer introduced the Slant-O-Matic, its first consumer zigzag sewing machine. The machine could do what no straight stitch model could: decorative stitches, buttonholes, applique, stretch stitches for knit fabrics, the kind of versatile sewing that the post-war American consumer was beginning to expect from a modern household machine. It was heavier than a featherweight, more complex, more expensive, and Singer believed it was the future. They had reasons to believe it. The numbers told a story that the featherweight's admirers might not have wanted to hear. By 1959, the domestic sewing machine market had reorganized itself around zigzag capability, and the competitive landscape had shifted with startling speed. Singer held approximately 61.4% of American multicam zigzag sales that year, a commanding position, but not an unchallenged one. Japanese imports had already climbed to 22.6% of the zigzag market. European machines held roughly 16%. The competitors weren't coming for Singer's straight stitch heritage. They were racing toward the zigzag future, and they were arriving with machines priced well below anything Singer was willing to offer. Inside Singer's strategy meetings, in rooms where men who'd spent careers reading sales data and production forecasts weighed the company's direction, the logic looked clean, even inevitable. Consumers wanted more features. Home sewing magazines promoted more ambitious projects. Fabric stores stocked stretch knits and synthetic blends that demanded stitches a straight stitch machine couldn't make. A featherweight, no matter how beautifully engineered, no matter how beloved by the women who already owned one, was a machine that couldn't sew a buttonhole, couldn't produce a decorative border, couldn't handle a stretch stitch on a polyester knit, couldn't do half of what the new models promised to deliver in a market where the new models were all the trade press talked about. The featherweight sat in its carrying case on the wrong side of that equation. 11 pounds of mechanical perfection, and every ounce of it devoted to a single stitch that the future apparently no longer needed as its centerpiece. This was the hinge of the entire story, the precise moment when Singer's proud past and Singer's ambitious future bent away from each other and never came back together. The company that had gotten the straight stitch more right than anyone in the history of the domestic sewing machine decided that the straight stitch was no longer sufficient. Not out of malice, not out of contempt for what the featherweight represented or for the women who treasured it. Out of a reading of the market that said simplicity was yesterday's selling proposition and versatility was tomorrow's, and that any company standing still while Japanese imports multiplied and European machines improved wouldn't survive the decade intact. The featherweight didn't vanish overnight. Production continued. Machines shipped. The lines at Elizabeth still ran. But inside the company, the energy, the engineering dollars, the design talent, the promotional budgets, the executive attention was flowing somewhere else entirely. Toward zigzag, toward automation, toward a vision of the American sewer as someone who needed a machine that could do everything, not a machine that did one thing with uncommon, unrepeatable grace. Standing at that summit, with zigzag sales climbing and Japanese competitors closing distance, and the American consumer demanding features the featherweight was never designed to offer. Nobody inside Singer's offices could see the full shape of what was coming next. The decisions hadn't all been made yet. The names hadn't been signed on the memos that would matter most. The plant in Elizabeth still hummed with a century's worth of momentum. The sewing centers still trained. The parking lots still filled before dawn. But the ground had shifted, and the machine, the 11-pound all-metal straight-stitch masterpiece that American quilters would one day call the greatest sewing machine ever built, was about to discover what it means when your own maker decides you belong to the past. The first Japanese-made sewing machines arrived in American stores in 1954. They weren't better than Singer's machines. They weren't more elegant. They weren't more reliable. What they were was cheaper, substantially, unmistakably, disruptively cheaper, and in a consumer market that had reorganized itself around zigzag capability, cheaper was enough to change everything. The scale of the price difference was not subtle. Singer told the U.S. Tariff Commission that Japanese manufacturers were selling automatic zigzag machines at prices averaging roughly $100 below Singer's minimum retail of $300, and in some cases, far below even that discount. $100 in the early 1960s was real money. It was a month's grocery budget for a family of 4. It was the difference between a machine a young wife could justify and a machine she couldn't. The Japanese imports didn't need to match Singer's brand recognition or century of trust or 600 sewing centers. They needed to sit in a department store next to a Singer machine, do approximately the same zigzag stitches, and cost $100 less. For a growing share of American consumers, that was sufficient, more than sufficient. The numbers accumulated fast. By the end of the 1950s, Japanese manufacturers had captured 22.6% of the U.S. multicam zigzag market, a share that had been essentially zero 5 years earlier. European machines, many of them built with a precision and design sensibility that appealed to serious sewers, held another 16%. Singer still commanded 61.4% of zigzag sales, but the arithmetic was merciless. More than a third of the American zigzag market now belonged to foreign competitors who hadn't existed in it a decade prior, and their share was growing. Singer's response revealed a company that understood the threat but couldn't agree on how to meet it. On one front, Singer competed through product, developing new machines, improving features, pushing the zigzag and automatic capabilities that the market demanded. But on another front, the company turned to the mechanisms of protection, patent enforcement, tariff complaints, and legal strategies designed to slow the imports down rather than outrun them. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually heard the resulting antitrust case, and the record that survives shows Singer engaged in a complex effort to block or contain Japanese multicam zigzag competition through patent arrangements, an effort that had the effect, intended or not, of using intellectual property as a barrier against price competition. The patent fight makes for a sharp scene in this story because it shows something more textured than corporate arrogance. It shows fear. Singer's executives weren't stupid. Donald P. Kircher, who had been the company's president since 1958, led an organization that could see its market share eroding in real time. The dominance built over a century by Isaac Singer's carnival salesmanship and Edward Clark's installment plans and decades of sewing center instruction and the accumulated trust of millions of American households was being undercut by competitors who hadn't invested a dollar in any of that infrastructure. The Japanese manufacturers hadn't trained homemakers. They hadn't staffed showrooms. They hadn't built a century of brand equity one parlor demonstration at a time. They'd built zigzag machines that worked well enough and priced them low enough that the century of equity started to matter less than the number on the price tag. And underneath the competitive pressure, the market itself was shifting in ways that made the imports harder to fight. Home sewing's long migration from necessity to pastime was accelerating through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Ready-to-wear clothing had improved in quality and dropped in relative price until the economic argument for sewing your own family's clothes had thinned to almost nothing for most American households. The woman who'd sewn in 1945 because she had to, because outfitting 4 children for school from a department store was beyond the family budget, was, by 1965, finding that the department store was cheaper than the fabric store. Home sewing didn't vanish. Millions of American women still sewed, still valued the craft, still took pride in the fit and quality of handmade garments, but they sewed because they chose to, not because they had to. And that distinction from necessity to choice changed everything about who bought machines, how often they replaced them, and what they expected those machines to do. Singer's own 1964 annual report acknowledged what the sales data already showed. Sales of low-priced straight-stitch machines were declining, even as the company maintained its position in higher performance models. The simple machines, the reliable, affordable, unglamorous workhorses that had been Singer's bread and butter for a century, were the first casualties of a market that no longer needed them the way it once had. The Featherweight, the most precise and most beloved of all Singer's straight-stitch machines, was on the wrong side of every trend in the industry its own maker had built. 3 pressures, then tightening at the same time. Foreign manufacturers undercutting Singer's prices with machines that were good enough. A consumer culture that no longer required a sewing machine the way it once had. And a company whose own product planning was already aimed at a future where the Featherweight's virtues, simplicity, durability, a single perfect stitch, looked less like engineering wisdom and more like commercial limitation. Each pressure alone might have been navigable. Together, they formed the current that would carry the Featherweight out of Singer's future entirely, and the company's next move would complete the journey. In 1964, Singer launched the Touch and Sew line with one of the largest promotional campaigns the company had ever mounted. The machine was everything the Featherweight wasn't. Complex, feature-packed, built around the premise that the modern American sewer wanted automation, wanted decorative stitch options, wanted push-button convenience, wanted a machine that could do dozens of things at the touch of a lever, rather than one thing at the turn of a hand wheel. The Touch and Sew sewed buttonholes automatically. It switched between stitch patterns without manual rethreading. It was, by the standards of 1964 consumer marketing, a technological statement. This is what the future of sewing looks like. The market response was immediate and emphatic. Singer's own annual report showed that Touch and Sew accounted for 39% of the company's unit sales in its first full year. And more revealingly, half the total dollar value of all sewing machine sales. That second number was the one that mattered in the boardroom. The Touch and Sew wasn't just popular, it was profitable. It commanded higher prices that customers were willing to pay. In a single product launch, Singer had shifted the commercial center of gravity in its entire sewing machine business away from the affordable, reliable, durable machines that had built the company for a century and toward a higher-priced, higher-margin line that embodied a fundamentally different idea of what a sewing machine should be. By 1966, the Touch and Sew had expanded to 5 models at different price points, and Singer reported that total U.S. unit sales of new sewing machines had topped 700,000 for the first time in the company's history. The numbers looked like vindication. The line was a commercial triumph by any metric the company's board would have used: revenue, margin, market positioning, brand perception. The Touch and Sew made Singer look modern in an era when modern was the most powerful adjective in the American consumer vocabulary. It made Singer look like a company with its face toward tomorrow. The Featherweight, meanwhile, was being allowed to die, not with an announcement, not with a ceremony or a press release or a farewell advertisement thanking 3 decades of loyal buyers. U.S. production of the 221 ended during the early to mid-1960s. The exact year depends on serial number analysis, and collector references differ on whether the final American-made units left the factory in 1961, 1963, or 1964. Some production of the white-bodied 221K continued at Singer's British facility until approximately 1968, but the direction was unmistakable, and the silence around it was the point. Singer let the Featherweight fade from its product line the way you let a conversation end, not by saying goodbye, but by simply not speaking anymore. Every dollar of engineering budget directed toward Touch and Sew development was a dollar that didn't go to the 221. Every showroom display that featured the new line pushed the Featherweight further from the customer's eye. Every advertisement that promised automation and versatility delivered a message to every American woman considering a sewing machine purchase that the future was complex, not simple, and that simplicity was something to be upgraded, not cherished. The women who loved the Featherweight noticed its disappearance, not as news because Singer never made it news, as absence. The machine that had been available at Singer dealers for 30 years was, quietly, no longer on the shelf. The carrying cases stopped arriving at retail. Dealer inventory thinned and wasn't replenished, and the quilters who'd built their craft around the 221's unwavering consistency began doing something that would define the machine's extraordinary second life. They held on. They kept their Featherweights oiled and running. They tracked down replacement parts through classified ads and swap meets and the growing informal networks of women who knew what they had and weren't letting go. They watched estate sales with the focused attention of people who know exactly what they're looking for: a black case, a chrome latch, 11 pounds of irreplaceable machine inside. But the Touch and Sew carried a detail that the quilters noticed first, and that the broader market would eventually confirm. The new machines were built differently from the Featherweight in ways that went deeper than features or aesthetics. Where the 221 used metal gears, machined, hardened, capable of meshing under load for decades without measurable wear, the Touch and Sew used nylon and plastic. Where the Featherweight's internal drive mechanisms were steel components designed to hold tolerances across a lifetime of use, the new models relied on parts that were lighter, cheaper to manufacture, and faster to produce. But that wore. Nylon gears that meshed smoothly when new developed play after a few years of regular use. Plastic housings that looked sleek when they left the factory became brittle with age, prone to cracking under stresses that the Featherweight's cast aluminum body had absorbed without complaint for decades. Whether this reflected deliberate cost engineering, a conscious decision to reduce material costs and build in a replacement cycle, or simply the standard material choices of an era that equated plastic with progress and viewed all metal construction as old-fashioned and unnecessarily expensive, the practical result was identical. Touch and Sew machines developed mechanical failures over time that the Featherweight was structurally incapable of developing: stripped gears, cracked cam followers, worn drive components that introduced slop into the stitch mechanism. The kind of progressive deterioration that a quilter notices in the quality of her seams before she understands it, as a mechanical failure. The stitch that's slightly uneven, the tension that won't quite hold, the skip that happens once and then happens again, and then happens often enough that the machine goes to the repair shop and the repairman shakes his head at the plastic gear fragments inside the housing. A machine designed in 1933 outlasted the machine designed to replace it. The women who'd held onto their featherweights, who'd oiled them and threaded them and carried them to guild meetings while everyone else upgraded, watched the touch and sew machines around them age and falter and break and understood, with the practical clarity of people who use tools every day, that durability is not a feature you trade away. It's the feature that determines whether anything else about the machine matters in 20 years, or 40, or 80. The Touch and Sew's commercial success was only one current in a larger transformation, reshaping Singer from the inside. By the mid-1960s, the company's leadership had reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable to Isaac Singer or Edward Clark. The future of the Singer Manufacturing Company did not necessarily depend on sewing machines. The logic was not irrational. The sewing machine market was mature, competitive, and under sustained pressure from imports that showed no sign of retreating. The long-term consumer trend pointed away from necessity sewing and toward hobby sewing, which meant a smaller addressable market, more price-sensitive customers, and less room for the premium margins that had sustained Singer for decades. A company that stayed exclusively focused on sewing risked becoming a smaller version of itself each year as the market contracted around it. Diversification offered growth. It offered insulation. It offered the kind of forward-looking narrative that Wall Street rewarded. And so Singer diversified, aggressively, across industries that had nothing to do with a needle, a bobbin, or a sewing table. The Frieden acquisition was the landmark move. Singer bought Frieden, a manufacturer of calculators and data processing equipment, absorbing a business machines company into what had been, for more than a century, a sewing machine empire. The strategic premise was that Singer's manufacturing prowess and global distribution network could be extended into new product categories, that the company, which had taught 400,000 homemakers to sew, could teach corporate America to compute. Other acquisitions followed in rapid sequence. Singer moved into defense contracting, building navigation systems and flight simulation equipment for the military, into furniture manufacturing, into housing development, into businesses that shared no technology, no customer base, and no institutional knowledge with the sewing machine lines still running at Elizabeth. Alfred DeScipio, Singer's group vice president, and Herbert Burchill, the vice president for product policy, were part of a leadership structure that was consciously remaking the company's identity. The 1966 annual report reads less like the financial statement of a sewing machine company and more like the prospectus of a diversified industrial conglomerate. The language is careful and deliberate. Growth segments, diversified revenue streams, reduced exposure to any single market. By 1967, Singer was telling its shareholders in plain terms that the company's dependence on sewing machines was continuing to diminish as its other businesses grew faster. That sentence, designed to reassure investors about the company's strategic direction, was also, whether anyone in the boardroom noticed or not, a eulogy. Singer wasn't just moving away from one product. It was moving away from the idea that had defined the company since 1851, the idea that Singer meant sewing, that the company's name and the craft were the same thing, that the woman threading a bobbin in her living room and the worker on the Elizabeth production line were part of a single continuous story that stretched back to Isaac Singer's rented shop in Boston. The resources followed the strategy. Engineering talent that might have designed the Featherweight's true successor, a machine that kept the 221's all-metal durability and stitch precision while incorporating the zigzag and automatic features the market now demanded, went instead to Frieden calculators, defense electronics, and real estate ventures. Development budgets that might have kept Singer's sewing machine line at the cutting edge went to businesses the company barely understood. The institutional knowledge accumulated over a century of making one thing extraordinarily well was diluted across a portfolio of things the company made adequately. The diversification didn't save Singer. It may have hastened the damage. The Frieden acquisition proved difficult to absorb. Integrating a business machines company into a sewing machine manufacturer's corporate culture was harder and more expensive than the projections had anticipated, and the calculator market itself was about to be transformed by the arrival of electronic computing at consumer price points. The defense contracts brought revenue, but also the volatility that comes with government spending cycles and political priorities. The furniture and housing ventures generated headlines, but not the kind of returns that justified the capital diverted to them. The conglomerate structure that was supposed to protect Singer from the risks of the sewing machine market generated risks of its own. Management attention fractured across industries that had nothing in common. Capital deployed to ventures that returned less than the cost of raising it. Executive focus diluted to the point where no single business received the concentration it required to compete effectively. The irony was precise and painful. Singer had diversified because it believed the sewing machine business was too risky to sustain the company alone. But the diversification itself introduced risks that were, in many ways, worse, because in sewing machines, Singer at least understood its customers, its competitors, and its own product. In calculators and defense systems and real estate, the company was a newcomer competing against specialists who'd been in those businesses for decades. Singer had traded the risk of a declining market it understood for the risk of expanding markets it didn't. And back in Elizabeth, where the plant still operated and the workers still showed up for their shifts, and the machines still moved down the line, though in smaller numbers each year, bound for a market that had more options and less brand loyalty than the year before, the consequences of the company's strategic turn were becoming visible on the factory floor. The plant was aging. Equipment that should have been replaced was patched instead. Tooling that should have been upgraded was maintained past the point where maintenance could close the gap. The capital investment that might have modernized the Elizabeth facility, that might have kept its production costs competitive with the imports flooding the American market, was flowing to Frieden and to defense and to businesses that carried the company's name but not its history. The workers could see it. You didn't need access to the annual report to understand what was happening. You could see it in the deferred maintenance, in the lines that ran slower, in the shift reductions, in the growing distance between the company's public statements about its exciting diversified future and the daily reality of a sewing machine plant that was being left behind by the conglomerate that owned it. The name on the water tower still said Singer, but what Singer meant, alluded to the investors, to the board, to the executives charting the company's course, was changing. And the workers who still walked through the Elizabeth gates every morning were beginning to understand that the change wasn't designed to include them. The Elizabeth plant didn't close the way a light goes out. It dimmed year by year, shift by shift, the way a town notices winter, not all at once, but in the shortening of the days. Through the 1970s, the workforce contracted steadily. 10,000 workers at the peak, then fewer, then significantly fewer. The layoffs came in waves. Not a single devastating announcement, but a series of reductions, each one smaller than the one that would have made headlines, each one large enough to empty another row of the parking lot and darken another section of the floor. Workers who'd expected to retire from Singer found themselves looking for work in their 50s. Workers who'd been hired with the understanding that this was a career, not a job, discovered that the understanding had been one-sided. Production lines that had run 3 shifts dropped to 2. Lines that ran 2 shifts dropped to 1. The energy of a plant running at capacity, the noise, the movement, the sense of a large organism working in coordination was replaced by something thinner and more fragile. Fewer workers doing the same tasks in quieter rooms. Machines that had run continuously now sitting idle for hours. The particular unease of working in a facility that feels too large for the work it's doing, where the empty spaces remind you every shift of how much has already been lost. 3,500 workers remained in 1973. That number, preserved in a federal court record filed years later, measures how far Elizabeth had already fallen before the final fall began. A 2/3 reduction from the peak, and the worst was still ahead. By the early 1980s, the trajectory was no longer ambiguous to anyone paying attention. Singer intended to shutter the Elizabeth facility by the end of 1982, 109 years after the company had purchased 32 acres on the waterfront, a century of sewing machine production measured in the end by a closing date. The workers knew, the union knew, the community whose diners and taverns and churches and schools had organized their rhythms around the fact of the plant's existence knew, and a group of them fought. The federal court record from that fight gives them names: Joseph DeBella, Thomas Murray, Francis Gibbons, Mel Blumenthal, George McLaughlin, Joseph De Bernardino, Joseph Krasinski. 7 men, joined by Assemblyman Raymond Lesniak, who carried the fight from the shop floor to the State House and from the State House to the courtroom. These weren't executives debating portfolio allocation around a conference table. These were workers and their representatives who understood what the closure would mean in terms that never appeared on a balance sheet. Careers measured in decades, ending without ceremony. Pension expectations built on the assumption that the company would honor its word. The daily structure of lives organized around a shift schedule and a paycheck. The whistle at dawn, the cafeteria at noon, the drive home in the evening, all of it ending. And behind each of those workers, a household, a mortgage, children in school, a set of assumptions about the future that were about to be proved wrong. The court filings tell a story of givebacks and broken faith, not the dramatic kind, no single betrayal, no villain speech, the grinding kind, the kind that happens when workers are asked to sacrifice and then discover the sacrifice didn't buy what they were told it would buy. The union had made concessions, workers accepted reduced compensation, trading present wages and benefits for the promise that the plant would survive. They'd bet, because that's what a giveback is, a bet made with your own paycheck, that if they gave enough, Singer would invest, would modernize the Elizabeth lines, would update the equipment, would give the century-old plant a chance to compete in a market that had moved on. Singer committed to spending approximately $2 million to restructure the facility. $2 million that was supposed to flow into new equipment, improved processes, the kind of capital investment that might have closed the gap between what the Elizabeth plant could produce and what the market required. For the workers who'd accepted the pay cuts, who'd gone home and explained to their families that the check would be smaller for a while, but the plant would stay open, that $2 million represented the company's end of the bargain. The tangible proof that Singer still believed in Elizabeth. The money wasn't spent. The restructuring didn't happen. The modernization that might have given the plant a fighting chance, that the workers had paid for in real dollars out of their own paychecks, remained a commitment in a legal document and nothing more. The last shifts worked their hours. The machines ran their final cycles. Somewhere on the Elizabeth floor, the last sewing machine component to be manufactured at a plant that had been building them since the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant moved through its final operation. Nobody recorded the exact moment. There was no ceremony, no speech from a vice president, no photographer from the company newsletter. A century of continuous production, and it ended the way a clock stops, without announcement, without audience, without anyone deciding that the moment deserved to be marked. The cafeteria that had served the morning crew, the one where workers ate eggs before dawn and drank coffee that tasted like the pot had been on since the previous shift, closed its kitchen for the last time. The locker room emptied, hard hats hung on hooks, tools sat in drawers that would not be opened on Monday morning. The parking lot cleared, not the way it cleared every evening, with the headlights filing out and the knowledge that they'd file back in 8 hours later. This time, the lot emptied the way a room empties after a funeral, slowly, reluctantly, with people looking back over their shoulders at something they weren't ready to leave. The shift whistle stopped. That sound, the one that had told the surrounding blocks for 100 years that the plant was alive, that the work was happening, that the paychecks were being earned, that the compact between the company and the community was still holding, went silent. And in Elizabeth, the families and the diners and the bars and the churches and the schools that had built themselves around the rhythm of that whistle understood that the rhythm was over. What followed was not dramatic. It was slow. It was the particular kind of damage that a plant closure inflicts on a community, not the catastrophe of a natural disaster, but the chronic wound of an economic one. The paycheck that stopped arriving, the mortgage that became harder to meet, the insurance that lapsed, the pension promises that suddenly felt provisional. The diner near the plant gate that had run on shift schedules, the one where the morning cook knew which workers took their eggs scrambled and which took them over easy, adjusted its hours, then reduced its staff, then closed. The bars that had filled on Friday evenings thinned out as the men who'd filled them found work elsewhere, or didn't, or moved away. The neighborhood absorbed the loss the way a body absorbs a blow, not by recovering immediately, but by reorganizing around the injury, finding new ways to function that accommodated the damage without healing it. Some workers found jobs at other plants. Other companies, other industries. Some retrained. Some retired early on terms that were less generous than the terms they'd been promised. Some simply waited, the way people wait when the thing they'd built their lives around has disappeared and nothing has arrived to replace it. A building designed for the constant hum of production, occupied now by a silence that didn't fit the space. A parking lot engineered for thousands of cars, occupied by cracked asphalt and the first weeds pushing through. A century of accumulated skill, the knowledge of how to build a machine that millions of people trusted, dispersed into retirement and relocation, and the fading memory of a workforce that had no plant to return to. 109 years, ended not by a single catastrophe, but by a long series of choices, each one made in a boardroom, each one reasonable on its own terms, each one moving the work a little further from the waterfront, where it had lived since Isaac Singer's successors decided that Elizabeth was the place to build. The former Singer complex in Elizabeth still stands, after a fashion. It's an industrial park now. The 32 acres subdivided and parceled, occupied by smaller businesses that share the footprint but not the purpose. In January 2024, a fire broke out on the site, large enough to send smoke across the neighboring streets, flames consuming a portion of what had already been converted and reconverted and leased to tenants who knew the address but not the history. The buildings that survive are still legible as industrial architecture. The scale, the loading docks, the bones of the thing. They are not legible from the outside as the place where the Featherweight was born. But the machine is still here, not in the plant, not in any corporate strategy, not in any product line or annual report or shareholder presentation. The Featherweight survived the way things survive when the institutions that made them walk away, in the hands of the people who refuse to let go. Walk into a quilting guild meeting today. In Ohio, in North Carolina, in Oregon, in a church fellowship hall or a community center, or a rented room above a fabric shop, and you'll find them. The black cases with the chrome latches, the lids lifted, the machines set on folding tables, plugged into extension cords, threaded with cotton, and run. Not displayed as antiques, not admired from a respectful distance. Used, sewn on, worked. Machines built 60, 70, 80 years ago, still producing the same clean stitch they produced the day they were carried out of the factory in Elizabeth. The collectors know the serial numbers. They know which production runs are most sought after, which finishes are rarest, which components are original, and which were sourced from parts machines. Featherweights change hands at prices that would have baffled the women who bought them new. Hundreds of dollars, sometimes considerably more, for a machine that's been out of production for over half a century. That market exists for one reason. Nothing built since has replaced the 221. Modern sewing machines offer more stitches, more automation, more features. None of them feel like this. The weight of it in your hands. The hum of the motor when you press the pedal. The smell of sewing machine oil when you open the case. That mineral sweetness, unchanged across the decades. The way the stitch comes out, identical every time. Top thread and bottom thread, locked in the same clean tension from the first seam to the last. These aren't sentimental observations. They're the engineering facts that explain why the machine endures. The Featherweight was built on a premise that Singer eventually abandoned, that a machine should do its job so well, so consistently, and for so long that the question of replacement never arises. Singer walked away from that premise. The quilters did not. The plant on the Elizabeth waterfront is quiet. The sewing centers are long closed. The door-to-door salesmen are a memory. The world in which Singer meant sewing and sewing meant Singer. The world of 600 teaching centers and parlor demonstrations and installment payment books and the shift whistle blowing over the neighborhood at dawn has receded into the kind of past that lives in attics and estate sales and the conversations of women who remember what their mothers taught them at machines that weighed 11 pounds. What remains is the machine, carried to meetings in bags sewn on the machine inside them, oiled with care, threaded with patience, still running, still right, still here, long after the company that built it decided that being right, once and permanently, wasn't a business model anymore. 11 pounds, one stitch, and the quiet stubbornness of a thing built so well that even the people who made it couldn't kill it.